Looked forward to this time together with you again. And today we want to just head into several lessons for the next few weeks about identifying and breaking the power of self-glory. And when I think about that whole concept about self-glory, the word pride, arrogancy comes into that. And we all have an element about us that is self-glorying and full of pride and arrogancy. And the reason why I think we ought to deal with it is because this is what really got Satan kicked out of heaven, is he began to think of himself. And so let's just look at a few scriptures in this first session together about how to identify and break the power of self-glory. The Bible says in Romans 12, verse 1 through 3, it says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And then he says, and be not conformed to this world. And in this light, I'm talking about not conformed to this world. This world is full of glory, self-glory, and pride. And he says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. Now watch what he says, for I say, he says, through the grace given unto me to every man that is among you. Here's what he says, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Not to think of himself more highly than what he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God has dealt to every man the measure of faith. And so we've got to watch ourselves so we don't think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think, okay? So he gives us that clear warning, Paul does, okay? And so when we think about that, James says this. He says, confess your faults, he says, one to another, that you may be healed. So what I'm asking for is that God would help me be transparent and that you'd be transparent about this whole thing about arrogancy, pride, and self-glory, and that if we do have it, that we would confess it. Confess it. And it takes humility to confess something like that. And he says, not just to God, but find someone you can confess your pride and arrogancy and self-glory to them, and that they could pray for you that you might be healed. Now, Matthew chapter 23, verse 10 through 12 says this. Watch what it says. Neither be ye called masters. Now, it says, for one is your master, even Christ. But he that is greatest among you shall be your servant. You know what he's doing right now? He's saying, to these guys, he said, look, if you want to be great, don't strive to be the master. Strive to be the servant, because the greatest one is the servant. He says, and whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. And so God says, look, in other words, the way up is down. The way up is not up. The way up is down. And the only way you can help people is you got to get underneath them and push them upward. In Mark chapter 9, verse 34, it says, but they held their peace, for by the way they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. Now, these disciples really had a problem. You know what it was? They in their brain, they were thinking about earthly kingdoms. Earthly kingdoms are ran on arrogancy, pride, and self-glory. But so they're having this argument, who's the greatest among them? Peter and John and James and these disciples and even Judas probably got in Judas in that, and they're arguing about who's the greatest, okay? And when it goes in James verse 35, it says, and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come unto him, saying, Master, we would that thou shouldest do for us whatsoever we shall desire. And he said unto them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said, look, grant unto us that we may sit one on thy right hand and one on thy left hand in thy glory. So in other words, these disciples, now think about this, they can't seem to get it straight. They're arguing about who's going to be the greatest. Then they go to Jesus and they said, look, when you get in your kingdom, I want to sit on your right hand, left hand. And really what they're doing is this, is they're still thinking about earthly kingdoms. They're still thinking about advice on your right hand and on your left. Look what everybody see us. We're going to be like your right hand, left hand man. And really, ultimately, God is going to deal with them in identifying breaking the power of self-glory. And so we're going to come back next week and take up some more scriptures. But I want you to let this resonate in your heart. Let this get in your mind and let's just get honest, because listen, That the Bible tells us that when pride comes, then comes a fall. I don't want to see you drop. I don't want to drop. I don't want to fall. I want to stay to the end in the race. I don't want my self-glory, my arrogancy, or my pride to get in the way. I hope this will help you.
Thank you for watching Pastor Marvin Smith's videos on identifying and breaking the power of self-glory. We'll be looking at 10 different things to identify in our own lives to be able to break this bondage that we have with pride and arrogancy in our lives. So stay with us, take this journey with us and with Pastor Marvin Smith. We'll see you next week. Thank you.